Chapter 3 Parthian Dominance. The opening of trade between Han China and Arsacid Parthia in the waning years of the 2nd century before Common Era marks the beginning of the second period of Parthian history, with its end being marked in the second half of the 1st century Common Era as Parthia's economic control over the Silk Road trade and military dominance over Rome in the region ends. This section of the historiography, around the opening of the Silk Road between China and Parthia, is a woefully small part of modern historical works, but what little exists provides tantalizing ideas about the effects it may have had. Brosius puts forth the idea that burgeoning trade with China was perhaps one of the reasons why Mithridates II wanted to gain more control over the northwestern border of his empire, for in 97 before Common Era, he subjected Armenia, an independent kingdom, to Parthian rule. Armenia, at this point in the history of the Parthian Empire, was far outside their core regions within the Iranian plateau and southern Mesopotamia. That Mithridates conducted military operations with the intent to subject Armenia so far from his region of control suggests an additional motive. I believe this motive was economic in nature, which can be reasoned from the times that Armenia was considered valuable to Parthian interests, combined with the information known about the Steppe Road trade route, which was in operation at this time. Brosius says nothing more on this topic, leaving it frustratingly vague, especially when considering only the overland Silk Road trade passing through the Iranian plateau. Even during the high points of trade between Parthia and Rome, goods and coin did not flow through Armenia, but through cities in northern Mesopotamia and Syria like Palmyra. This leaves Armenia out in terms of its independent economic value. But when one considers the goods flowing in from the Eurasian Steppe, Mithridates' actions and Armenia's value become more tangible. In the literature surrounding long-distance trade between Han China, Parthia, India, and Rome, two main routes are discussed to the point of near exclusivity: the Silk Road overland route through the Iranian plateau, and the spice route between India and Egypt over the Indian Ocean. While both are certainly important and compose the vast majority of the luxury good trade between these empires, a third route existed as well, waxing and waning in importance as its neighboring trade routes fluctuated through the years. This steppe road, as Raoul McLaughlin calls it, is not a new idea, but rather an economic exploration of traditional nomadic movement across the Eurasian steppe. On this steppe road, goods were not transported by merchant caravans or imperial envoys, but by the steppe people who populated the region. Goods were acquired from China, either through the raiding of settlements or the acquisition of tribute, and were transported across the Eurasian steppe by the many tribes that populated the area. The end point of this steppe road is more nebulous than the Silk Road or spice route, as nomadic groups often traded with settled societies on the southern border of the Eurasian steppe in Bactria and Transoxiana, making exact calculations difficult. However, McLaughlin argues that much of the luxury goods that survived their passage on the steppe made the journey north of the Aral and Caspian Sea before terminating at trade posts on the Black Sea, both north and south of the Caucasus Mountains, an area controlled by Armenia. With this context, the actions of Mithridates II start to make more sense. Having traded luxury goods with Han China for over a decade by the beginning of the 1st century before Common Era, Armenia represented two things: an additional source of luxury Chinese goods, and a potential competitor to Parthian merchants in selling their own goods. For reasons related to their handling of the Kushan Empire that I will explore in Chapter 4, I believe the former was a far more driving concern to the Parthian kings than the latter. Whatever cause drove Mithridates II to subjugate Armenia, it was while meddling in their affairs that the Parthians first encountered the Roman Republic, represented by then proconsul Lucius Sulla, and made the first territorial agreement between the two powers, marking the Euphrates River as their territorial border. This agreement lasted for 3 decades, surviving 2 political crises involving the expansionist actions of the Romans, one in 69 before Common Era, with the commander Lucullus threatening to attack an Armenian city, and the other in 66 to 65 before Common Era, with Pompey looking to change the status quo. More than anything, the actions of Rome and Parthia in the first 40 years of the 1st century before Common Era are indicative of the two powers feeling out the strengths and weaknesses of the other, an unsteady peace that violently collapsed in the 50s before Common Era, as the triumvir Crassus made war on the Parthian Empire. The beginnings of open military conflict between the two powers resulted in a century and more of Parthian dominance on battlefields, largely outside their core territories. In 53 before Common Era, at the Battle of Carrhae, the Parthians inflicted a brutal defeat upon Crassus, killing or capturing tens of thousands of Roman soldiers, and deporting the surviving captives to the eastern edge of their empire. Within a decade of this victory, the Parthians launched a major raid into Roman Syria and were only forced back after years of pillaging Roman territory. In 36 to 33 before Common Era, the Parthians beat back a Roman invasion under Mark Antony, inflicting a major defeat upon the general and killing tens of thousands more Roman soldiers. This series of losses convinced the expansionist and militaristic Rome to establish a peace in 20 before Common Era with Parthia that persisted for half a century. Not until the 30s Common Era did Rome attempt to re-establish political and military control over Armenia, prompting military action from the Parthians in the wars between 58 and 63 Common Era. This last set of conflicts, establishing a sort of dual control between Parthia and Rome over Armenia, was also the last military conflict in this second period of Parthian history, and the last time for a century and a half that Parthia achieved military and political success against the Romans. This military success is the most clearly visible hallmark of this second period of Parthian history, but it does not exist in a vacuum. This is also the period of history where Parthia saw the most success in controlling their economic interests in general, and the Silk Road in particular, with the socio-political benefits that naturally came from such success. Rather than an Oriental empire in decline due to claims of the powerful nobility that de Beauvois and Coleridge discuss, the Parthian Empire of this period was dominant, politically and militarily. Rather than their repeated military conflicts with Rome fracturing their power, the Parthians of this period presented a united front against Roman political intrigue and military might. The Parthians not only controlled their own territory to great effectiveness, but were also able to launch a major, years-long raid into Roman territory and compete politically with the Mediterranean superpower over the political fate of Armenia. The Silk Road of the Second Period. The economic control over the luxury goods trade, both on the Silk Road and the Steppe Road, allowed the Parthians such success in this period. For this discussion, we turn once more to Han China and the late 2nd century before Common Era for the true beginnings of the legendary trade route. Once the Han Emperor and the governing elite knew of Western settled peoples, trade began quickly. By 119 before Common Era, the Han were able to reoccupy lands north of the Yellow River that had previously been under Xiongnu control. By circa 111 before Common Era, Sima Qian writes that up to 10 trading caravans were setting west annually, sometimes comprising complements of several hundred men. In 104 to 102 before Common Era, the farthest commanderies of the northwest regions were established, creating trade routes safe from the worst predations of the Xiongnu tribes, making long-distance trade a far safer activity. Less than a decade later, the Parthians subjugate Armenia, cementing a new endpoint for not only the Silk Road trade they had been benefiting from, but also the steppe road and the goods that traveled upon it as well. Moving briefly back to McLaughlin and the steppe road, it was once again Han Chinese policy that drove the economic development of this trade route. With the steppe road luxury goods originally obtained through raiding of Chinese towns and villages, there were frequent reprisals and conflicts between the Xiongnu and Han living on their northern border. However, developments in Han diplomatic strategies simplified the process greatly. Instead of trying to fight the Xiongnu, the Han instead gave them annual bribes of coinage, silk, and food, with the intent to mold the nomads into a form of economic domestication. By all measures, the Han Chinese seem to have been successful at this policy. The Xiongnu of later years were less violent on the whole, and by the end of the 1st century before Common Era, the Xiongnu were so indebted to Chinese economic activity that acquiring access to the border markets of the Han became important parts of the nomadic diplomatic playbook. This development is important to the discussion of the steppe road because it increased the quantity of luxury goods entering the Eurasian steppe, thus increasing the quantity of luxury goods exiting the steppe in Armenia, increasing its value and sparking continued conflict over its subjugation by both Rome and Parthia. This transference of goods was almost certainly less efficient than the transfer of goods along the Silk Road, or later along the spice route, but the steppe road was also almost certainly in practical operation from long before the Silk Road was established, given our understanding of Xiongnu raiding practices. This flow of luxuries may not have been exceptionally valuable during the high points of trade along the Silk Road, where better quality and larger quantities of goods could be transferred, but during slow periods of trade, the goods that entered Parthia and Armenia from the steppe became increasingly valuable. As well, during the opening of trade between China and Parthia, and later between Parthia and Rome, the wealth that Parthia could extract from the merchants that traveled along the roads was passed on in price to Roman merchants. This spurred Rome to seek out alternative sources of the luxuries coming across the Parthian Empire and gave them an interest in Armenia, that endpoint of the steppe road. The Parthian and Roman interest in Armenia can only be satisfactorily explained through this economic argument that has not been fully made before. Armenia served as a buffer state between the Parthian Empire and Rome, providing them a non-native territory to fight over, to discourage more damaging wars upon their own territory. But this does little to fully explain why Armenia became so important to either empire. The Parthians and Romans already had a common border between Roman Syria and Parthian Mesopotamia, and the military importance of Armenia to one side or the other was relatively small. Even when the two powers went to war, Armenia often acted independently, no matter which side currently had the region subjugated. Not only does viewing Armenia as an economic endpoint of the steppe road explain the fervor with which both Rome and Parthia acted to try and dominate the region, but it also puts forward some explanation of why Parthia, in 216-17 Common Era, reopened hostilities with Rome and made Armenia a battleground once again. It is sufficient to say here that the known decline in trade over the spice route and Silk Road due to war and disease caused a resurgence in importance of the steppe road, with their limited transmission of goods becoming a valuable asset once more to a Parthian empire attempting to regain its position of power. This will be discussed in further depth in Chapter 5. The Silk Road trade that Parthia oversaw greatly enriched the rulers of the Iranian plateau and continued to do so even through the various wars that were fought between Parthia and Rome. Even during conflict between the two powers, Palmyra remained an intermediary trade city, giving both sides a neutral place to buy and sell goods. Beyond this, we must understand that the caravans traveling through Parthia were not technically Parthian at all. It seems likely that the Parthians were primarily overseers in the Silk Road trade, facilitating safe routes for caravans to travel upon and taxing those caravans to extract their wealth. The caravans themselves were likely made up of local peoples moving goods from one end of their territorial region to the other, transferring to other peoples as they went. As such, the caravans moving between Parthian and Roman territory were like Palmyrene, which gave them some immunity from the conflicts that raged around them. This is not to say that the Parthians did not engage in limiting or changing the relationship of trade through their empire, especially with Rome. For example, the Parthians were able to use their control of the Silk Road and the merchants that plied its routes to their advantage in making peace agreements. One of the terms of the peace agreement between Parthia and Rome in 63 Common Era dictated that Palmyra was to be the only city of trade between the Parthians and the Romans, showing two things. First, that unrestricted trade across the entire Roman-Parthian border was something Rome did not want, implying a discomfort with how much wealth flowed from Roman coffers to Parthian ones. And second, that even though they wished to curtail and regulate the Silk Road trade, Rome was unwilling to tolerate a total cessation of luxury goods coming into the empire. This dynamic, and the desire for luxury goods by the upper classes of Roman society, provided the impetus for much of the next 200 years of Roman economic and political activity in the East. The trade between Parthia and Rome had two major benefits for the Parthians. First, it enriched Parthian coffers, whether indirectly through Roman coin that was spent crossing the Parthian Empire, or directly through the taxation of the caravans that traveled through their territory. Second, this trade forced a tacit agreement between the Parthians and the Romans that war between the two powers could not ever be too deleterious to economic operations, else both sides suffer. Towards the first benefit, there is clear evidence that Roman leadership was upset at the state of economic affairs along their eastern border. Pliny the Elder commented that great effort went into procuring Chinese silks so that our ladies may in public display their charms, while Seneca the Elder commented of silks that wretched flocks of maids labor so that the adulteress may be visible through her thin dress, so that her husband has no more acquaintance than any outsider or foreigner with his wife's body. It is difficult to attribute this kind of writing to simple moral fear-mongering of Pliny or Seneca. Rather, they are better seen as signs that the Roman elite was coming to understand the problems with their consumption of luxury goods from the Far East, made even clearer with the Senate's attempt to ban the wearing of silk by men in 14 before Common Era, an effort that went almost entirely ignored. Even the members of the Senate were later berated by the Emperor Tiberius for their wearing of silks and use of perfumes and spices. These complaints are made in terms of concerns toward Roman morality, but it was economic distress over the unequal trade that drove such actions. In discussing this unequal trade, Pliny does give some hard numbers to explore. Pliny writes that Rome's trade with India and Arabia cost the empire 50 million sesterces a year, while their total trade with the Far East, including goods shipped from China through the Silk Road, came to a total cost of 100 million sesterces lost per year. Even if these numbers are inflated past the realm of reality, they provide good evidence of how prominent Romans thought the Silk Road and spice route trade affected them. Even if the trade wasn't truly draining Roman coffers of coin and goods, the fact that the Roman elite believed in the loss of wealth gives rationale for their attempts in the East to either dominate Parthia or circumvent it entirely. The domination of Parthia, as discussed above, was a greatly problematic issue for the Romans of this period. Crassus and Mark Antony learned firsthand what the Parthians could accomplish, fighting in their own territory, and the Parthian excursion into Syria showed them to be a dangerous force outside their homeland as well. Domination was a poor avenue to redress economic woes, and over time the Romans turned instead to circumvention, which, along with the rise of the Kushans in the east, spelled the end of this second period of Parthian history, and marked the birth of their third period. The correlation between Parthian political and military success and their economic control of the Silk and Steppe roads is unquestionably strong. As the Silk Road trade continued, Parthia expanded their area of influence and repeatedly met the Roman Republic and then Empire on the field of battle, besting them each time and inflicting upon them vicious defeats. Had the Parthians remained in such control over the Silk Road, or remained militarily dominant as that economic control faltered, there would be less reason to believe this economic argument I have provided. However, as I will explore in this next chapter, the Parthian fall from military and political power and the collapse of their economic control over the luxury goods trade went hand in hand.